quasi-annual. We obviously had to take a little break for the global pandemic. But our fourth Appalachian Spoken Traditions event put on by the Department of Communication. And so I don't want to take up too much of your time with myself, so I'm going to get right into our speakers. Our first speaker is a senior music industry studies student from Wilmington, North Carolina. That is Linda Garcia.
This is a poem/story that I wrote. It's called I Don't Sleep Alone Anymore. The exhaustion creeps over me, and at the same moment I let go, halting the chore of folding my bones and surrendering into your mattress. It has about 3 inches more fluff than mine at home, so I sink a little deeper here. I keep track closely of where my thoughts go, eyes closed, watching them carefully dance about, mostly going back and forth between reflecting on the day that happened in my presence and watching a new day play out in the most dreamlike and unconscious manner. And in the darkness, in this half-awake state, I can feel the light pour softly over my head, becoming aware of how thin my eyelids must be. The light could be exuding from myself as a sort of euphoric glow. It could also be from the street light right outside the window. Who knows? The air around us grows colder, and all I hear is it being pushed about. Yet my covered body stays so warm, with much help from the closeness. The bottoms of my feet sink fully into a good place. They can rest now. I'm alone with my shoulders and my neck, my arms and my tummy, but my feet have found themselves a confidant, reminding me to share, that the space I may occupy is not only my own. Our feet begin to trade cold for warmth and vice versa. A delicate practice. We're both aware, but we never address it in the morning. These certain times allow me to soon fall asleep, despite the immense content and excitement of the touch that fills my heart 3/4 full. Exhaling deeply grants me the sweeter dreams and the deepest sleep. Continuing to sink, forgetting to remember, letting the air conditioning drown out my own condition. Our feet continue to rest together. The most grounded, planted, stable parts of us find peace holding each other, even through the turbulence of crossing over. The jolts of our muscles as they begin to relax and forget the day along with our minds. I hear the shallow breathing and the deep as well. Eventually we sync up with each other, as if we're resetting simultaneously. I whisper my love out loud and then softer and softer until only my mind hears it and it fades with me, setting a precedent for the next fleeting hours in my new world. Everything stays still, patiently waiting for our return. It's a miracle that the room can look the same in the morning, even though moments ago I was in a different world entirely, parting to sea while he was living a new life, or an old one, right next to me. To leave and come back again is such a mischievous thing. Why we feel the need to go so far is no surprise to me. Yet every night our feet carry on our conversation, anchoring us here when we grow too tired to bear it. And every morning everything is just in its place, just as we left it. Every morning I'm grateful to see the flowers hung and to hold my own once more. That's that one. That was actually a little bit of a prompt that Aaron gave me up here. He told me to think about something super mundane and that we all experience and just go in and write about it and make it interesting and full of intent, and so that was me falling asleep. This next one is a shorter one, a little poem called Ladybugs. Oh, to have a handful of ladybugs, to see them fly and return again, to lay flat on the wet grass and feel the plants growing up towards me. I love this line, to think about how life on earth is literally growing up to us so that when we sink down, we find ultimate support, lifting us up and holding us. I want a porch, one that rots and I can replace plank by plank myself, one that I'll paint and repaint when the time comes. A garden, to place the abundance in this world in my own hands, a reminder to water and to nurture when it comes. The plants and myself alike. Maybe I'll have a fruit tree, or a few. That was that. And this last one is called A True Love Letter. Finding pieces of you, well, I know you're still around. A muse with such a beautiful cadence. I've never been so grateful for my eyes, to see you walk around in my mind. I see you treat it like home, taking your shoes off at the door. You know you can be comfortable here, and I'm so happy to have you. To walk with you out in the April sun, eyes squeezed by the light, and I'm so glad. Sinking into feelings I may be weary of. What is there to be weary of anyways? I've never met a feeling that didn't comfort me once I understood it. Our feet bearing the earth because otherwise our heads would go and go and go. I'm curious as to what's up there, but God forbid if we let go, we'd never come back. When our feet grow tired, we can take flight for a while like that paper butterfly on Sunday mornings, only to sink back down in the name of love, to find the ground and remember how to hold it.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is a North Carolina native who grew up wandering these beautiful Appalachian mountains and now works in overdose prevention here in Boone. Please welcome Ashley Ward.
Somebody told me the order and I don't know what to say, so I'm just going to read. Hollow fruit. She stood at her kitchen sink, scraping seeds out of the belly of a ripe melon. Wetness slipping through her fingers, and thought, this is what my heart felt like the day you left. The very things that make growth possible removed. Hollow. Cleaned out. A sudden solution to a problem she wasn't sure she could solve. She didn't know then how entire ecosystems grow from crevices, cracks, depletion. Mighty trees spring from broken and decaying wood, abandoned, forgotten in the fold. Excavation, preceding the becoming of whole. The fruit dies, the seeds live on. This one is called Lost Twice. I lost my grandmother once to dementia, and a second time when she passed on from this realm earlier this year. Driving past places where American boys are made into men who are turned into killers, I'm wishing I was crying again, ready to sit on the sand and write sad songs. Songs I'll never write the music for, that will live without a melody inside my head. Even when she no longer knew my name, I would crawl beside her in her hospital bed and lay my head where her breast had been. I watched as her once voluptuous body inched closer to skeleton, the pain of dying written on her skin, papyrus, her veins blue ink seeping through. Pulling the covers back over my head, I miss both versions of her. The her who barely knew who I was most days, and the her of 20 years ago, jet black hair kept firm. She told me I looked like Liza Minnelli when I cut my hair short, dyed it dark, told me I would travel the world someday. It was really her I was imitating, not Cabaret. I can't remember if I ever told her that. I looked at myself in the mirror yesterday afternoon, sorrow seeping from my pores and pajamas, searching for signs of her. 3 decades of incomprehensible hurt staring back at me, contained in the colored parts of my eyes. Rumi was neither wholly right nor wholly wrong. Sometimes the light enters the same place as the pain. The wound, a double-edged opening where the blade once tore through. Sometimes withdrawing the implement causes even more damage. Months ago, before she died, he showed someone I may never meet a photo of his sweetheart. They told him those hazel orbs had seen a lot of pain. Sometimes it is shadow that enters the wound and lingers. She would have loved him too, and somehow that hurts more than if he had been yet another breaking man walking down the road of destruction, spiteful smile in his pocket, cigarette between his lips. Roots and bones. Skeletons of affirmations, phrases of comfort dripping down my throat. I am walking in circles and spinning in circles, laying on the ground. Me. Here. Now. Tasting the sweet honey of presence, connection sending electric waves of light through long forgotten nerve endings. I found you in the forest, manifested magic, conjured, conjectured, conjugated. Irreversible, like burning these pages of flowing letters, faded lines, ink blotted with tears. Joy or sorrow? Both. I come back, we inhale, count, then out through the mouth. Breathing exercises I will never figure out. Me, here, now. Unsure of who I am without all these scars, memories of nights spent silently sending desperate prayers to a distant God. Why doesn't he hear me? 20 years of unanswered pleading. A friend more than twice my age tells me, no is also an answer. But I was begging for safety. Me, here, now. Victory doesn't come from warfare. It comes from surrender. Mouth painted red, hair dark as night, slowly became someone else. A pinned-up version of the little girl who read books on the playground while her classmates played merry-go-round tag. Goofy with glasses, unsure of herself. Hating the brown strands flowing from her scalp, the paleness of her skin. She grew into a woman who exudes a sexual, sensual sort of undertone, warmth beneath cool water, broken heart beneath still surface. Confusion, misunderstandings, mixed signals. Me, here, now. She exchanged her body for currency, and her value increased, her knowledge and insight, an education even an Ivy League can't teach. There was never anything to be ashamed of. Learning this while wondering if he can hold dear every piece, every part of her. Cold air enters hot lungs, a slight moan, gasp. Windows clouded with condensation. Me, here, now. Wake in the middle of the night, he is sleeping next to me. First instinct, leave. Finest quality of flight, fawning and freezing are close seconds, thirds. Fight was always the last resort. He tells me that he loves me. I know. Acceptance, process-centered, goals other than parting by death. Infinite love, ripe, taking, and I bring myself back. Me, here, now. And this one is called Pansies. Daylight. I grew pansies from seeds this summer, cheery fellows in bright button-ups who have diligently survived the digging paws of an anxious pup. Too much rain and not enough. They smile at me from their pots, various shades of purple, amethyst, violet. A pop of yellow here, a burst of white there. I've never grown pansies before. Just as I've never haphazardly moved potted plants from my house to that of a close friend, turned lover, turned more. And I never expected those short-lived perennials to outlast the life inside of me. Less than a month ago, we materially combined our lives, two households becoming one in anticipation and excitement. I wonder if trees feel either of those, if mighty oak sells tents in preparation for acorns, maple branches clenching in their knowing that green will soon become red, cherry limbs pulsing as winter approaches, poplar holding back as best she can right before spring. Night. I realize that I won't be waking up. This isn't a dream. This is the real part. Tall pines watched me weep through the windows, a single planet and 1,000 stars offering solace as he wrapped his arms around me. We are in love and we are grieving. This place is strange and unfamiliar, and I now know what barren feels like. It's morning again. We laid in bed, my fingers tracing lines, collarbone, ink-set waves. It occurred to me that when I said I wanted us to go to places we had never been, this was not what I meant. Mid-afternoon, I find myself annoyed with our pansies and their foolish optimism, grinning at me as if the world is still right side up. He says he likes the way they vibrate as we walk across the deck, slightly bobbing, all but climbing up and over to greet us. It has been said that nobody can keep on being angry if she looks into the heart of a pansy for a little while. I am skeptical at best.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Our next presenter is an employee and part-time student here at App State and hails from Cary, North Carolina. Please welcome Ryan Wood.
I didn't think to print anything off. It's on my phone. My name is Ryan Madison Wood. I'm a recovering alcoholic and addict, and a big part of my writing comes out of that. It can be stressful, so I'm sorry. This one's called I Always Did. My head drummed as I lifted it from bed sheets that were a pallid white, but soft in the way gentle piano plays at bars you shouldn't black out. But I did. She was making breakfast like always. The smell caressed my senses like a loving hand to tell me it's okay, that I am forgiven. How did I get so unlucky? I started to rise, looking for my pants in our hurried pile to undress. Nothing beats a fight with no shirt, dirty jeans. I found her blouse first, reminded that nothing beats a fight with no shirt, dirty jeans except her. I had tried it the night before. My pants were buried under her blouse in our hurried pile, not to undress, but rather to please God for once, let's just go to bed. She won the way she always did, the way she always should have. I got dressed and silently enjoyed scrambled eggs that were sunflower yellow and soft in the way gentle piano plays at bars you shouldn't black out. But I did. This next one is called Kindred. It's about finding community. I waited in the stream, running behind once a home, now property. I let cold water run through my toes, retrieve me. I am 10 again, unafraid and unalone, for something about the cold, despite the light of the sun, draws me and crawdads alike. Hiding beneath rocks, I dare not disturb their comfortable dark. I can't but empathize. The sun illuminates my friends in a warmth of company, and they come to me. This one is called Goosebumps. I held a piece of God in the palm of my hand. It looked like an apple, picked by an unknowing child, believing as his grandfather does, atop some Blue Ridge mountain, even older than him, where cool breezes speckle bare skin with ripples in facsimile of the only mountains that can grow apple trees like those. A big part of the writing that I've done in recovery has been a journey in reprocessing things that have happened to me in the past. In 2019, my mom passed, and I used that as an excuse to drink and behave the way that I did. And in reprocessing that and trying to come to terms with the reality of it, that what it was, this came about, and it's more representative of, inspecting the event through exaggerated mindsets than it is of any reality. What it's like. Mom had those varicose veins. Rivers of life ran her arms from elbow to knuckle, knee to toe, crossing under, weaving over each other. A perfect network, life's corridors, her essence. Whatever God she believed in must have adored his handiwork because he took it back. I asked what it's like to be cremated. Mom didn't like surprises. After they told me, I felt shaken like a soda can, or at least a lonely, oblong, imperfect bubble inside, waiting for the crack of the tap. I must have been pale. They regretted telling me. I had to stay strong. I had to. I didn't. Auntie's face was wet, matted with hair, caked in sweat, Head on a swivel, she'd bolt any second. Her nostrils flared, lava bubbling in anticipation of eruption. She wailed, louder and louder, then quieter. A heave and nothing. A gape, no sound. A top, losing momentum. Grandma was stoic. She carried Auntie. She had called me 2 days before. This is the hardest news you'll ever get. No regard for her breaking it. An ox, she carried the weight. Our grief, our fatigue, without second thought. She'd known death, her parents, not Jewish, but still the wrong German. We got lucky, I heard. Dad, newly sober. He wasn't fully there, out of the bottle. He'd gone before I was 6. They'd married that year. The Bahamas, no less. He remembered most the open bar, not the warm, salty breeze, nor her. He became a statue, eyes pinned to the floor when they called time for the viewing. He never kissed her, just the gin on her lips. Mom was laid flat in a cardboard casket. The hospital gown covered her squarely. I stared for a while, waiting. She still had her varicose veins. I hoped she would move. They wouldn't let her, I know it. Lips sewn shut to prevent her saying what's next, or even goodbye.
Thank you very much, Rand. Our next presenter is an author, singer, and songwriter who's lived in Boone for the last 12 years and is reading from her book, Finding Hope in Rituals of Grief and Healing and Holy Unhappiness, God, Goodness, and the Myth of the Blessed Life. Please welcome Amanda Oppold.
So tonight I'm going to be sharing from my book, A Hole in the World, Finding Hope in Rituals of Grief and Healing. And I want to be sharing with you the story of the naming of Jane's Bald up on Roan Mountain. Has anyone been to Jane's Bald on Roan Mountain? Okay. It is a mountain that I have a particular interest in, and as it is Indigenous Peoples Day, I want to note that it is the original homeland of the Cherokee people. And my mother's side of the family has lived on the side of Roan Mountain on the banks of Little Rock Creek in a little community called Glen Eyre. Anybody heard of Glen Eyre? Yes, my people. Maybe we're related. But they've lived there for over 200 years. So growing up, I would go visit my great-grandmother's house there with my sister, Rachel, and we would often make the winding drive up to Carver's Gap to Roan High Knob and see the rhododendrons blooming and hike up on Jane's Bald. So over the years, I became curious about the naming of this part of the mountain. Who was Jane? And what had she done to earn the distinguished honor of having a mountain named after her? Whenever I was up on the Rhone, I asked the old-timers I saw up there, and most of them just shrugged. And a few of them, including my own kinfolk, told me that the mountain was named after a woman, presumably Jane, who had died of milk poisoning up on the Rhone. But in my heart, I knew there was more to this story. About 4 years ago, I began doing a deep dive into Appalachian culture, particularly Appalachian mourning and grief rituals, because I had experienced a profound loss of my own. In 2019, I lost my only sibling, my older sister Rachel, to sudden illness. She was only 37 years old. And her death was the atom bomb that went off in my life, as others have spoken of tonight. I was completely disoriented by this loss, and I found, as most grievers do, that the practices surrounding grief and bereavement in our modern American culture are woefully inadequate, yeah? But I found that my study of ancient traditional grief rituals was comforting somehow. They shed light on so many of the chaotic thoughts and emotions I was having in the aftermath of my sister's death, so much so that I wrote a book about it called A Hole in the World, Finding Hope in Rituals of Grief and Healing, and published during the pandemic, a time when so many of us were experiencing loss and grief. So as I was researching and writing, I spent a lot of time at the family graveyard there on Roan Mountain, learning about decoration days. Anyone familiar with Decoration Day? The practice of decorating the grave, cleaning and putting flowers on the family graveyards annually. I learned about the all-night wakes that used to take place in Appalachian households. And during this time of research, I found myself being drawn again and again to the Rhone, to this mystery woman, Jane, who had given the mountain its name? Who was she? Who had grieved for her? What was the story of loss surrounding her that was obviously profound enough to name a mountain after her? And so I went on a mission to find out, to know her, and it bordered on obsession. I was like a dog after a bone with this story. And this is what I learned. This is the story of James Bald. The story of James Bald is a story of a family of sisters. In the 1990s, an Appalachian journalist, I don't know when he did the interview, but sometime in the 1980s, I think, an Appalachian journalist named Michael Jocelyn interviewed an old woman named Elsie Yelton. And she was the granddaughter of the woman who actually died on the mountain. And he published her account in 1999 in the Johnson City Press, which if you Google, you can find. And so I'll read this little portion from my book. According to Elsie, in 1870, her grandmother Harriet decided to cross the Rhone from North Carolina with her sister Jane in order to visit their two older sisters who lived on the Tennessee side of the Rhone Mountain. Harriet had recently recovered from milk poisoning, a disease brought on by drinking milk from a cow that had eaten the white snakeroot plant. Anybody know what white? I actually brought a prop. This, I'm going to shed it if I take it out. This is white snakeroot. You might see it around town growing on the side of the road. It's kind of a wild flower that should not be eaten by cows if you want to stay alive. She felt that so Harriet had recently recovered from milk poisoning, and she felt she was strong enough to make the journey, although another sister named Judy warned her and Jane not to go. She had a feeling of dread about it. And after an uneventful crossing and a good visit with the Tennessee sisters, Jane and Harriet began their return trek home over the Rhone on November 16th. The weather shifted, as it is apt to do in the mountains, we all know, from warm and sunny to cold and cloudy, and Harriet became weaker and weaker as they climbed higher and higher. And by the time they reached the Balds, the milk sickness had returned and made her extremely ill. Unable to continue on, Harriet and Jane hunkered down in the mountain for the night, the wind whipping around them. Jane didn't leave her sister's side, keeping vigil over her weakened body, watching for bears and bobcats. At first light, Jane fled down the mountain in search of help. Charlie Young, who lived in a cabin not far from Carver's Gap, brought his wagon as far as he could, then climbed up to find Harriet, still alive, but very frail. He helped both women into the wagon. Jane was almost frozen to death herself. Harriet, who was only 24, died shortly after they made it home. Jane, however, went on to live a long life well into the 1940s. No doubt she carried the memory of that fateful journey always. From the day of Harriet's death onward, all the locals called that portion of the mountain James Bald. In honor of the fierce, freezing vigil Jane kept at her sister's side, in honor of her pain, in honor of her loss. So every time I walk upon these hills, my heart aches for Jane. She must have been so scared up there on that windswept mountain in the dark, cold unknown. Author Amy Dillard once said, mountains are giant, restful, absorbent. You can heave your spirit into a mountain and the mountain will keep it folded and not throw it back. This mountain, our beloved Rhone Mountain, has kept Jane's pain, her grief over her sister's death and her inability to save her. Jane's survival, her persistence through grief, is now memorialized, majestically displayed by this towering, immovable mountain. And those of us who have grieved know that to survive a loss so significant requires you to be as rooted and resilient and resolute as an ancient mountain like Rhone Mountain. Jane, who I named my daughter after, Harriet, two sisters, and a mountain named not in honor of the one who died, but in honor of the one who lived, the one who grieved. Thank you.
Our next speaker is a sociology major and an English minor, all the way from Tallahassee, Florida, Allie Penton.
My first poem is called Broccoli, and it's about my new broccoli plants. Tiny holes appear in their leaves, minuscule stool, like the size of a needle. One morning, out yellow curtains, they're all gone. The stem is near naked, a stick figure blowing in the wind, clothless, rooted. Maybe it was a beetle, or a burglar, or too much water, or not enough sun. This next one is inspired by a spoken word poem by Sarah Kay called If I Should Have a Daughter. If I should have a daughter, I will teach her to love the fat on her belly like we love our dog. Her artwork will hang crooked on the refrigerator, and the stairs will creak each time she tiptoes down them because it's late and she's not tired. When she leaves, she will learn that life is punctuated by moments, and some moments end in question marks, and uncertainty is a thief. But take a walk, sweet girl. Life isn't a Hallmark card, it's a homemade gift. Smash a plate into the concrete and bring a broom. On that walk, she'll notice the trees, and that among them are hundreds of different shades of green. But the trees ask questions too. I won't have the answers, but I'll tell her I can hear them too. This last one is called Tiny Beautiful Things. Last week, an old man softened his voice and told my friends, "You belong here," as we danced and did somersaults in the grass of Valley Crucis. All the way home, we blasted gospel music with the windows down, each of us in touch with a different version of God. Tonight, I baked a cake to celebrate the mundane, Monday. This morning, I met a woman in her poodle Louie on the way to school, and the woman thanked me for talking to her. In the kitchen, there are fresh tomatoes, and I repotted my broccoli and fed them fresh soil. The back door of the porch is open, and the wind moves yellow curtains. Orange leaves signal that fall is coming sooner than we think. I am telling her about tiny, beautiful things, and she says, "How is your grief?" But I'm not talking about my grief. I am talking about tiny, beautiful things. But my grief is in the roll of the somersault in the valley, and my grief is in this new obsession with the divine. Even though I can't define divinity, it is in each wildflower behind the dumpster. It is in baking a cake because it's Monday.
Thank you, Alex. Our next speaker works here in the Counseling and Psychological Services Center at App State. She has a PhD and LMFT. Please welcome Gayatri Titus.
There is so much peace when you learn to let go of expectations, born out of illusions of how things must be. That is the birthplace of disappointments. Be still, and you will see that there are some who will leave no matter what you do or say to make them stay. For you will never be enough for them. And then there are some who will just stay, for they will see their own reflections in the broken parts of you. You are not alone. I may never understand why strangers help me, or how I find kindred spirits who come my way. Maybe my soul is connected to others in ways I cannot fathom. Perhaps we have met in another lifetime somewhere. Silence has its own voice, so gracefully taking so many different forms. Sometimes in a glistening dewdrop that landed quietly on the bed of a lily pad. Sometimes in the journey of a leaf as it pours ever so gracefully from its tree. Sometimes in the resplendent adieu of a sunset as it disappears in the embracing arms of the ocean. sometimes in the rise of the full moon as it reveals itself between the veil of the parting clouds, sometimes in the sky of a million stars where one of them guides me from beyond. I think it carries my mother's name. My memories are settling down like fallen leaves in the autumn breeze. I have nurtured them too long amidst many winters. I have carried them everywhere, even in the torrid sun. I've held them in the freezing rain, hoping they would keep me warm. They asked me to release them back unto the earth they come from. So I agree, and I watch them float down the river of reflections. They thank me for setting them free, and I thank them in return for all they brought to me, and most importantly, for teaching me how to practice some gratitude, equanimity, empathy, and humility. Memories fall from my eyes of yesteryears, those beautiful moments hidden carefully in the crevices of my soul. When the universe felt aligned, when I was home, there are so many things I long for, but nothing compares to the sound of hearing my mother's voice calling my name. I looked at the sky and I asked, how do you expect my heart to hold so much sorrow? And the sky said, sometimes it's okay to just let it rain. Thank you.
So this event, being 4 years old, we've had obviously tons of talented speakers from our university and our community, as you've seen tonight. But we have our first two-time speaker today. Michael Edgerton spoke at this event, the second annual event. Was it 2019?
Sure, man.
Something like that. He's a very entertaining author. He's a graduate of our electronic media and broadcasting program. And again, he's a presenter in this particular event and in our Panorama event that is our spring event. So please welcome Michael Edgerton.
Makes it sound like I do a hell of a lot more than I do. Well, this is a story operating under the title Black Lung Blues, mostly because Black Lung Boogie felt a little tonally inappropriate, but it came about after a double feature of Harlan County, USA, great documentary, have to recommend it, and then Godzilla, because I love good creature feature, and that idea of the design of Godzilla is based around like keloid scars, and those scarring from nuclear bombs, and thinking about a creature feature, it kind of gives you that vibe of what a lung looks like after black lung. Here we are. Sheriff Freddie Blair flicked the safety off his pistol, his index finger twitching against the trigger guard. The diesel engine sputtered off and died, struggling to pull the workers back from the depths of the mine. Freddie kicked the engine with a steel-toed boot, and it coughed back to life in a plume of black smoke as the mayor came up next to him. Canary better be belly up if they're servicing this early, Mayor Arthur said, in his own wheezy way. Freddie didn't hear him. He kept tapping the trigger guard, wondering what would be driving them out of the coal mine 7 hours before their shift was set to end. He was hoping for a gas leak. Deputy Colm told him that if you dropped a match in a leaky mine, the whole thing went up like a volcano. Freddie smiled a greasy, yellow-toothed grin at the thought. Hellfire spewing from the mines. He fell in love with the smell overseas, the only time he was warm with a flamethrower strapped to his back. You gone deaf, Freddie? The mayor coughed up a wad of phlegm blacker than the diesel smoke. Your stitches are bleeding, Freddie said. Arthur touched a hand to his bisected cheek and winced. Smiley, they called him during the election. He flashed the broadest grin while evicting miners who joined the union, and kept smiling when he ordered Freddie to threaten anyone suspected of joining the union. Arthur just didn't look right without that smile, and 2 nights ago, someone fixed it to his face with a razor. Wouldn't even need these if you did your job better. Arthur took a long draught from his flask. Yup. Freddie smacked his lips. but never broke contact with the mine. The engine stopped, and 6 miners spilled out of the cave mouth. The tallest one looped the canary cage's handle onto his arm and scrambled away from the trolley. The bird sang high and thin, as if nervous of a cat stalking beneath the wooden cage. Freddie curled his fingers tight around the pistol grip as the 2 men dragged a limp corpse from the trolley. They dropped it onto the ground and scurried away from the mine shaft. "You boys drag him over so I can get a look," Freddie called. "I ain't getting near him," the taller of the 2 men said. Freddie shifted his hip to accentuate the revolver. The man shrugged, set down the canary, and heaved the body over towards Freddie and the mare. "Wipe that shit off your face," Freddie pointed to the tall man. The man pulled a rag from his jumpsuit and smeared off enough of the dust to show his features: a squat nose, high cheekbones, and deep-set eyes hooded beneath his brow like shimmering slag glass. Freddie recognized him as a man named Quint. He had kind of suspected he was the one who had slashed Arthur, not for any evidence, but guilt by association. That was good enough. During the strike, Quint's roommate Johnny had tossed a firebomb into a busload of scabs coming to cross the picket line. Reports said he disappeared in the ensuing riot, which, loosely speaking, Freddie thought, was true. "Christ," Arthur said when they dropped the body. "A rock collapsed on his leg?" The dead man's cap hung to his thigh by a few threads of sinew. "Weren't okay then," the shorter of the miners said. "Something down there." Arthur laughed. "Like what, a bear?" "Maybe," Quint said. "What do you mean, maybe?" Freddie asked. "Dark, hard to see. Didn't get a good look at it. Albert's lantern went out, and next thing we know, we heard him scream out. So Jim fixed his headlamp on it long enough to see something trying to drag him by the leg. All he managed to get him out by chucking rocks down the tunnel, trying to scare it off." The others gave an account near identical to Quint's. "Uh-huh. You stay right here now," Freddie told Quint, then ordered the other miners to bring the body back down to the doctor, and asked Arthur to fetch Deputy Coleman. "And ask him to bring that shotgun, too." The men shuffled to town, and Arthur finally took his hand off the revolver. "You ever been bear hunting?" Quint crossed his arms. "I ain't going down there with you." "That's fine. If you don't want to go into the mine, you can always take that shovel and dig yourself a cozy little hole. Either way, you're going back down." "Why?" Quint pressed. "Ask you a few more questions about Smiley's new look. Good a time as any, I reckon." Freddie slapped Quint's shoulder and laughed. The sound punched and died at a snotty growl. Colm came 10 minutes later, the shotgun slung over his shoulder and a fresh oil lantern in hand. Freddie took them both and ordered Quint to grab the canary. We have a little bit of a page break. Difficult to see. Quint understood there was very little in this world he actually understood. Johnny was always the smart one, the clever one who recited passages from the Bible and the UMW pamphlets from memory. God and John Lewis didn't stutter, and neither did Johnny. Quint, well, he liked to listen. And he listened to every sound there was in these hills. You know how black bears roared when they were cornered, and how mountain lions could screech like a crying child to draw you out into the kill zone. The sound he heard when Albert died? Never heard a thing under the sun with such a sinister growl. It reminded him a little bit of catfish fresh from the river, chuffing and croaking. "All right, bloodhound," Sheriff Blair said. "Get sniffing." Quint stared at the mine's toothless maw. Even from here, he could smell the earth's rancid breath, sulfur and ammonia. Together, he and Blair mounted the trolley, creeping deeper into the mountain's black throat. His heart pounded and his lungs ached, and any last glimmer of sunlight was gone. The lantern light cast a meter only about 5 feet ahead. The mine was cheap, cheaply managed, and cheaply supplied. The electric lights worked only a few days out of the week. This old oil lantern and the temperamental headlamp Quint wore were the only guiding lights with which Blair expected to kill a monster. And that it was a monster, Quint had no doubt. He'd lied to them for fear of ridicule. When that thing took Albert's leg, he saw a hand. Worse, he watched claws sink deeper into the flesh, hard and gnarled but slick like copperhead scales. Quint guided them through the tunnel, slicked the condensation, down the slope towards the cave where Albert died. The slope would end at about a mile, turn downward again, then evening out a few miles from their destination. Quint followed his nose as much as his memory, following rotten egg and fresh excavation. His chest got heavy, and when the smell got to be too much, he fell into a coughing fit. When he tasted blood in his mouth, he swallowed it back down. Johnny told Quint it was easier to pretend nothing was wrong if you never saw the blood. Plenty of things taste like blood, he'd tell him. Keep it going, Blair said. Careful down through here. Quint touched the wooden ribs supporting the roof. Beams are dry rotted. All ready? Quint shrugged. Company recycled wood from the old construction. Gotta work with what we get. They moved a few yards forward, the canary singing intermittently. That thing ever shut up? Only when it dies or gets scared. Blair poked the cage with his gun a few times. The bird flapped back and forth in his little prison. Gonna give me anything to defend myself, or am I just a bait? Oh, you don't got that razor on you anymore? Jesus, just because I wish I'd cut the mayor don't mean that I did. Quint bit his tongue. Close enough to guilt, I reckon. If wanting to kill Arthur were a sign of guilt, he'd be the prime suspect. Blair pressed the scattergun into Quint's back. He stopped, kept his hands to his side, the way his pa always told him to do if he were arrested. The barrels twisted into his spine, but Quint kept his muscles loose. Mind who you're talking to, or I'll put you down and bury you next to that old boy Johnny. Blair laughed, lowered the shotgun, and Quint turned and punched Blair square in the gut. The sheriff's old aching trigger fingers spasmed, and the twin barrels fired. He missed Quint by several feet, but blew out the rotted beam supporting the ceiling. It crashed in a surge of dust, blocking Quint and Blair from the exit. Quint leapt onto Blair, smacked his head into the ground. They wrestled there for a while until Quint's lungs flared up. He curled on the ground, seized in a cough. Blair kicked Quint's stomach and, drawing his revolver, pinned him to the floor. He jabbed the barrel into the stomach. Ooh, pardon me, old document. How am I doing on time? The familiar taste of blood flooded his mouth, and with each passing cough, Quint's mouth got fuller, hot and sticky with whatever his lungs could purge. Blair twisted the barrel again, barking something at him, but Quint couldn't hear him. His temples pounded and his ears were full of a high ringing. All the time, the canary sang. Quint aimed for Blair's eyes and spat. The sheriff dropped the gun, wiping his eyes with both hands. It was just enough time for Quint to shove Blair back to the ground and make for the revolver. I don't want to shoot you, Blair. Funny way of showing it. Quint pulled back the hammer. I could show you the other way out of the mine, but not if you try and kill me. Blair left. Quint pulled the trigger, and then a second time, again and again. He hit Blair on the second shot, square in the chest. He fired again, the gun bucked. He blew a quarter of Blair's head clean off. The air got thick with a reek of sweat and sulfur, blood and bile. He threw the gun down the mine shaft as if it had turned to a viper in his hands. Christ, he muttered. The word turned the poison in his mouth. The blood did nothing to wash away the coal dust, and his lips were already cracking. When he felt a little more composed, he squatted over Blair's body and rifled through his shirt for the spare shells. A wet heat lingered in the cool air over Blair's wounds. Why'd you have to give it back up? For once, couldn't you just stay down? It hurt his lungs to talk, but the canary wasn't singing, and in the silence, he heard the murderous gunshots ring fresh in his ear. He thought of Johnny kneeling over an open grave, and Blair standing above him, with the revolver pointed at his skull. With the lantern hanging off the shotgun barrels, the canary cage hanging from his elbow, Quint made for the other exit. It was the only emergency measure the company had taken, so that if the main entrance collapsed, there'd be a chance to retrieve what was left of the coal and maybe some bodies if they were left. The lantern's glow had gotten dimmer, and he now had no more than 5 feet of light his way. Quint told himself that when his feet got tired and the freezing air stiffened his sweaty clothes, that sunlight was only a mile or two away. Like the blood leaking from his blackening lungs, it was easier to go on if he ignored the truth. The truth of the distance between Quint and dawn was measured in hours, not miles. When the scorching in his chest quieted, he started up again. The canary resumed his song, and in that there was some comfort. He remembered when he and Johnny, as boys not yet old enough to go to the mines, would hike out to Brown Mountain. Johnny's grandpa told him about balls of fire that danced over the valley, twisting through the night, graceful as any firefly. As they got older, quick-fingered Johnny slipped bread from the company's store and flasks of corn liquor from Old Man Curtis's still, and together they'd look for those Brown Mountain lights. Every Saturday they picked a new spot. Johnny would point down to the mine, so small from their vantage, and tell Quint that if they dug deep enough, they'd make it to the other side of the world. Somewhere where Sheriff Blair and Old Smiley and the Duke Power Company couldn't force them to dig their graves in exchange for a few tons of dirty rock. The hike stopped when Johnny went to work. He trudged home covered in soot, with darker stuff than coal dust on his lips. Quint listened to him in his sleep, coughing and choking, as if he had a chicken bone in his throat. He'd watch how he'd strangle the bottle, throttling the last precious drop from a slender neck. There was one last picnic before the Union declared strike and Johnny threw that bomb. Even down here in the cold stink damp of the mine, Quint felt the warmth of Johnny's body leaning into his. He even felt the tears wet against his cheek when Quint told him that they could start digging tonight, and they might be able to start their new life within a week. They saw them that night, hovering over the valley, balls of fire dancing in the sky. He watched rhododendron pinks and magnolia petal whites, and reds deeper than what came spilling from Blair's open skull. All the while life went silent, as if nervous to draw the orb's attention. Then, as soon as they came, they darted off into the starry midnight. The canary stopped its song, and Quint held the lantern to the cage. Shit. The bird was belly up. He slipped his hand out from the looping handle and pressed forward, quicker than before. The lantern cut the darkness, and with the shotgun pointed forward, he probed the tunnel, until he felt the barrels push against something hard. The scales glinting in the light weren't smooth and continuous, like the snakeskin he imagined. Rather, they were hard and porous, rising and falling as if breathing themselves. And as the scales moved, he spied oyster-colored flesh beneath, oozing crimson with each rip. The raspy, wet inhalation filled the tunnel, the same shattered gas Johnny made in the middle of the night after one of his coughing fits. No sooner had the gun scraped the beast's skin than it opened its damp eyes, and they fixed Quint in place, a deeper shade than the lights over the mountain, or even the sickening slime that oozed from the scales. Quint pulled the trigger, but he was met with a tinny click rather than a satisfying boom. The shells were dust. The creature swiped a broad hand at Quint. The blow missed, but he stumbled and fell hard against the ground. The mineshaft filled that awful chopping as the creature skittered towards Quint and hovered above him. Its mouth opened so wide he thought it would fall off the hinges, the way Arthur's had when Quint swiped the razor through his cheeks. Out from the thing's mottled gums slid rows of needles. Quint grabbed the shotgun by the barrels, slammed the butt into its head. It staggered, just long enough for him to get to his feet and dive for the lantern. He held it high and prayed for a methane leak and smashed it against the rocky floor. In the town, they felt the shockwave, heard the thunder, and watched the billowing mountain of smoke block out the moon. No hellfire surged through the mine's many arteries, just enough to further collapse the structural integrity, forever burying Quint and Blair's remains. That's what I got for you.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker, our keynote speaker, comes to us from the University of Kentucky. He's a prolific author. Some of his work include Lost Mountain, A Year in the Vanishing Wilderness, Radical Strip Mining and the Devastation of Appalachia, as well as Utopia Drive, a road trip through America's most radical idea. Please welcome Eric Rees.
Thank you. I live in central Kentucky, and 10 years ago I got married, and my wife and I moved to the woods to a little creek called Clear Creek, and I spent the last 10 years writing about it, and most of the writing was done outside. So this is a book that follows the seasons of Clear Creek, and I'm just going to read a passage from the beginning and from the end that I think kind of hold together. I don't know if the idea of a morning ritual was particularly American, but I do know Benjamin Franklin put much stock in it. From 5 to 7 a.m. every day, he would address powerful goodness. My day gets started a little later than that, but I like the notion of beginning with a routine that aspires to powerful goodness. Today, under a cool, overcast sky, I drink my coffee from the only cup I ever saw my grandfather use. It's a white porcelain mug, hand-painted with strange blue flowers. My grandfather, a Baptist preacher with a deep fundamentalist bent, would sit on his own deck overlooking the Chesapeake Bay and drink 1 cup of instant coffee after dinner. I came to associate that cup in some childlike way with his ministerial authority, with his unquestioned moral rectitude. It became an extension of a man I loved profoundly. A child of the Depression, my grandfather was a saver who owned very few possessions. My mother always assumed that since my father, my grandfather's son, had committed suicide when I was 3, my grandparents were banking their money to leave to me and my uncle. I suppose she thought of it as a kind of reparation payment to make up for my missing father. But towards the end of his life, my grandfather gave all of his savings to missionaries working to stamp out paganism in South America. This development drove my uncle, already a brittle man, into a vertiginous feeling of betrayal from which he never really recovered. But as someone with pagan tendencies myself, I wouldn't have felt right accepting his patrimony, my grandfather's, and I never gave much thought to the hundreds of thousands of dollars that bypassed me like a Cessna disappearing into the Amazon jungle. After my grandfather's funeral service, I went back to his Bayside house, a 13-sided structure on stilts that we called the Roundhouse, and emptied a half pint of bourbon into his coffee cup. I sipped the warm liquor in bed while I listened to my uncle fume about my grandfather's will out in the main room of the house. Then I fell asleep to olfactory dreams triggered by the salty air sweeping in from the bay. The next morning, when I packed, I placed in my bag the one thing I would take to remember my grandfather, that cup. Then I left his home in Tidewater, Virginia, and never went back. Still, I've taken great care of my grandfather's cup with its strange blue flowers, and I drink my coffee from it every morning. Above the treetops, 3 crows are mobbing a sharp-shinned hawk. Down here in my Adirondack chair, I hear the cheerful zree of pine siskins. That's followed by the whirring wings of the season's first hummingbird, a male that flashes his sequined red throat for a second at the feeder and then is gone. The hummingbird's arrival signals that the pine siskins will be soon departing, moving north. They've been good winter companions, and I'll be sorry to see them go. On one arm of my chair, a translation of the Upanishads sits inadvertently on top of my field guide to Kentucky wildflowers. They are each, I realize, guides to 2 worlds, one inner, one outer. Each points to the oldest scriptures, one that spreads across the forests and fields of the inner bluegrass, and one that tried to capture, through pictographic Sanskrit, the soul's own terrain. Swami Vivekananda, the man who introduced Vedanta religion to the United States at the end of the 19th century, warned that books never make religions, but religions make books. Here in the United States, we have indeed vanquished the gods from the sacred oaks and pressed them into books. The problem is that within books, religions often ossify into doctrine and dogma. Religion begins with genius, intuition, imagination, then fossilizes into creeds that get set down in books. The search for God within oneself becomes instead a campaign to impose one's religious views on others. But for Vivekananda, all religions are manifestations of one fundamental impulse, what he called the realization of God in the soul. To find God within oneself is simultaneously to recognize the one behind the many, and in so doing, connect the Vedas to the field guide, the creator to the creation. In this way, all of the world's theistic religions are branches of the same tree, different articulations of the original voice that whisper to us of our own divine, though hidden nature. My grandfather was indeed convinced of his own superior religion, and he spent his whole adult life trying to impose that vision on others. He once told me that Jews who converted to Christianity in the concentration camps were spared the gas chambers. His dogma, his church, his oppressive certainty eventually made my father's life unbearable, and my father ended it at age 33. So now when I read Vivekananda's words, it is good to be born in a church, but it is bad to die there, I find myself in profound agreement. The ceremonies and symbols of the church are good for children, he wrote, but as we grow, we must become our own individual churches. In the relinqueries of the human heart, we light our own candles, burn our own incense, find our own salvation. In the Baptist church, when you leave one congregation for another, it's called moving your membership. I have decided to move my membership to Clear Creek. I don't mean for that to sound like a complete betrayal of my grandfather, and I don't mean to paint him here as a one-dimensional demagogue. He was a man capable of both great compassion and great cruelty. I once overheard him in his church office giving comfort to his crying secretary whose husband had left her. And I once heard him denounce his own son, my uncle, in the most profane and revolting terms. He spent hours each week visiting and praying over sick congregants in the hospital, yet he was neglectful and dismissive of my grandmother. The fact is, I simultaneously loved and hated him more than any other man I've known. I wanted to please him more than any other person in my life, and when I realized the folly of that, I tried to get as far as possible from his crippling influence. I spent many years trying to be him, or trying to be what I thought he wanted, and then I spent many more years trying to be the exact opposite of that. At some point, I realized that the second reaction wasn't so much a rejection of my grandfather, it was an attempt to find what my father couldn't, namely my own way in the world. Now I hold on to my grandfather through the one possession of his I still have, this coffee cup. But I couldn't hold on to his religious arrogance, his moral certitude, his bitter belief that the wrong son had died. That I saw was deadly. When my grandfather died, we were barely speaking. The relationship was badly damaged, irrevocably perhaps, but I was alive. If losing my grandfather's love was the price of learning to live with myself, that was a price I knew I finally had to pay. By walking away from my grandfather's church, I knew I was walking in the right direction, one that eventually led me to the unroofed church of Clear Creek. Here, I decided I would work out my own metaphysic, a religion that applies only to me. And this is the second part. It's 15 degrees this morning when I go out to refill the chicken's watering stand, the one with an electric heater attached to the base. My reward is 9 eggs nestled in one corner on a bed of straw. These hens haven't laid in 2 cold gray weeks, but I gather up the eggs, tuck them in the pocket of my barn jacket, and go up to the house to make breakfast for Melissa, who's sleeping in. I layer slices of ham and avocado on rafts of toast, then set the fried eggs on top, a sort of eggs Benedict. The orange yolks are so rich a hollandaise sauce would almost be redundant. After breakfast, I build a fire in the wood stove. We move our chairs closer to the heat and settle in for what Melissa calls a lazy day of reading. Because it's Martin Luther King Day, I decide to revisit his letter from Birmingham jail. In an age so devoid of rhetorical elegance, so relentlessly shrill, it's a lesson in subtlety and surgical persuasion, an essay that bears returning to again and again. The events in Birmingham in 1963 crystallized for King the necessity of nonviolent civil disobedience over simply making moral appeals to the consciences of Southern whites. If you create enough tension, you attract attention to your cause, King reasoned. And it was the events in Birmingham that finally got the attention of John and Robert Kennedy and led to the March on Washington later that year. A year earlier, students at Mills College organized a boycott of Birmingham's downtown businesses because they refused to hire black people or let them sit at lunch counters. As president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King was frustrated that since the Montgomery boycotts, he had not been able to secure for his cause the attention of the national media, or even a majority of what he called white moderates. Birmingham looked like an opportunity to dramatize the humiliations of segregation and the need for federal civil rights legislation. Under the sway of the Ku Klux Klan, the city had become so violent that black residents referred to it as Bombingham. A movement quickly formed there with the goal of abolishing discriminatory hiring while desegregating lunch counters, restrooms, and fitting rooms. During a demonstration on April 7th, Birmingham's Public Safety Commissioner, Bull Connor, unleashed snarling German shepherds on the crowd. The city convinced a circuit judge to issue an injunction against all future marches or protests. On Good Friday, an apprehensive king appeared before his fellow SCLC lieutenants in overalls, prepared to be arrested. The small group began walking toward City Hall in what King called a prayer pilgrimage for 4 blocks. But 4 blocks into the march, a paddy wagon appeared and everyone was carted off to jail, where King was placed in solitary confinement and prevented from communicating with his lawyers. So instead, he got to work on a long letter. It was a response to another letter signed by 4 bishops, 3 Protestant ministers, and a rabbi that had just appeared in the local newspaper. They called on King to end his nonviolent resistance in Birmingham and let the courts settle the issue of integration. King began writing his letter in the margins of the newspaper, then on scraps of paper, and finally on a pad provided by his attorneys. Letter from Birmingham jail appeared a month later in a pamphlet published by the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker group that had been fighting racism in the 1920s, since the 1920s. 80 years later, what seems so impressive to me about King's letter is his agility at engaging an adversary. In an age where we seem to only yell at or past those with whom we disagree, King's approach is masterful and something I think we might learn from. For one thing, he accepts the 8 clergymen as men of goodwill and begins from there. King never doubts the other men's motives or their consciences. He never questions their status as men of God. In other words, he never threatens them with his own obvious moral high ground. Rather, King says, in essence, I've patiently listened to your point of view, so please extend the same courtesy to me. He knows their grievances and reminds them that he knows. He's an outside agitator. His work is untimely. He breaks laws. He precipitates violence. He's an extremist. Then he proceeds to methodically address and dismantle these claims. Precipitating violence, isn't that like blaming a man who just got robbed for having some money on him? Extremism, wasn't Jesus an extremist for love? And while we're on the subject, wasn't he also an outside agitator, stirring up the Roman cities of Palestine with his message of extreme love? Untimeliness, history is a long, tragic story dramatizing the fact that a privileged majority seldom willingly gives up that privilege. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, writes King. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Which brings us to lawbreaking and direct nonviolent action. The latter for King and the SCLS involved 4 steps: the collection of facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and finally, direct action. When negotiation fails, one must train oneself in nonviolent resistance and then act. If that action breaks the law, it must ask if the law being broken is just or unjust. If it is deemed unjust, if it degrades human personality and gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority, that's King, then it must be broken. Writes King, an individual who breaks the law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for the law. I offer this quick and inadequate summary of King's letter because it always amazes me how many Americans I meet who haven't read it. Everyone has heard the I Have a Dream speech, but that's a performance, a brilliant one. The country was never the same after it, but it wasn't the model for an American rhetoric of persuasion going forward that the letter is. In my opinion, its only rival is James Baldwin's excoriating book-length essay, The Fire Next Time. The 2 men had much in common. Both were raised in the Black Christian church and both had fathers who were ministers. But Baldwin, who became a child preacher in Harlem, was the son of a menacing father with schizophrenia. To escape his father's rage, Baldwin left home early, abandoned the church, and became a freelance writer who, unlike King, had no formal education. And unlike King, Baldwin's own inherited anger and disgust extended to the black church as well as the white. American Christianity, in his view, bred a pacifism whereby modern Christians prayed for salvation from this world but did nothing to make it better. Towards the end of his preaching career, Baldwin said it took all of his strength not to tell his congregation to, quote, throw away their Bibles and get off their knees and go home and organize, for example, a rent strike. For Baldwin, there was a profound contradiction at the core of Christianity. The message of Jesus, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, had been hijacked by, quote, the mercilessly fanatical and self-righteous St. Paul. As a result, this history of Christianity was one of, quote, unmitigated arrogance and cruelty and an indispensable justification for the planting of the flag. It was a Christian, after all, who brought some African to this country in chains, gave him the name Baldwin, and forced him to bow down at the foot of a cross. In the end, decided Baldwin, the only way to lead a moral life was to abandon any Christian church, black or white. But as the relentless argument of the fire next time unfolds, something rather amazing happens. Though Baldwin never admits it explicitly, he inserts his own secret gospel into his attack on Christianity. That is to say, he reclaims the true message of its founder, Jesus, and makes it his own message for America if it ever hopes for atonement and release from a history of violence and hypocrisy. Hate, he writes, is a mask we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. Love, as a state of being, is the only force that can unmask the tragic lives of all men and women. Baldwin wrote The Fire Next Time the same year King wrote a letter from Birmingham jail, 1963. I find that rather astonishing. Out of a cauldron of national division, distrust, and violence came these voices of empathy and purpose, voices that more than anything else showed a way forward. There are actually two versions of King's letter. The longer one, the one I am reading now, appeared in his book, Why We Can't Wait, and it levels much more condemnation at the white church than does the original. In it, he remembers many ministers rationalizing their acquiescence to segregation by saying, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. A position that, as Baldwin also knew, ignores basically everything Jesus taught. And King admits in the later version that when he drove past beautiful churches in the South, he wondered, who worships here? Who is their God? I think about my grandfather's church in rural Achilles, Virginia. It was a plain brick structure with a high white steeple. When I was a child and my mother and I went to visit my grandparents after the death of my father, the two of us would play a game of who could spot the steeple first over the tall Virginia pines. At the back of the church baptistry was an inept rendering of a thoroughly anglicized Jesus, and the plaster walls of the sanctuary were as white as its congregation. When I got older and my grandfather was retiring from preaching, he revealed to me his decades-old plan for what he would have done had a black person attempted to worship at the First Baptist Church of Achilles. I simply would have said the benediction and dismissed the congregation immediately. I can't remember what my response to this was, but I'm sure it's nothing that would have impressed Dr. King. When my uncle, my father's brother, died in 2007, there were few mourners at the funeral and fewer at the graveside. Like Baldwin's father, my uncle had been mentally ill for a long time and had finally driven away or abandoned his few friends. My grandparents were dead, and most of their friends who might have attended had also passed away. I myself was out of the country, but my mother tells me that as she and my stepfather watched the casket lowered, a car she didn't recognize pulled up. Two black women, one in her 60s, the other her adult daughter, approached the grave. They said a prayer. My parents looked on but said nothing. After the interment was complete, the older woman took my mother aside and told her that for 30 years she and my Uncle Dan had been lovers. After my father died, my grandfather decided that my grandmother needed something to do with her grief. So he set her up as the director of the Friendship House, a Baptist-affiliated organization that offered after-school and summer programming for children of color in the forepart of Newport News. My grandmother had an office on the 3rd floor of the large old house and basically oversaw the books and signed the checks. My uncle started volunteering at the Friendship House as well. That's where he met Mary. They started to see each other on the sly, or at least unbeknownst to my grandparents and the rest of our family. Then Mary got pregnant. She and Dan went to see my grandfather at his church office. They told him the situation and said they wanted to get married. No one in the family knows exactly what my grandfather said to them. We do know that he forbade it. He convinced Dan and Mary that such a union would jeopardize his own position as pastor of a white church in conservative rural Virginia. Dan, of course, was a full-grown man who didn't need his father's consent for anything. But my grandfather wielded the same psychic power, the same domineering force over my uncle that he did over my father. Dan backed down, acquiesced. Mary said she was going to have the baby anyway. My grandfather bought her off. He purchased a house for her. Maybe there were other payments along the way as well. My mother isn't sure. But we do know Dan kept seeing Mary and her daughter for years to come. My mother said it suddenly made sense to her why at every family holiday, my uncle left immediately after dinner and didn't return until well into the early morning. Finally, Mary gave Dan an ultimatum. Either marry her or forfeit any more opportunities to see his daughter. But Dan, who we know was in love with Mary, couldn't do it. He couldn't step up. The specter of my grandfather's disapproval was still too much, still too debilitating. Mary and her daughter moved away from Newport News, settled in South Carolina. Mary told my mother that she never saw my uncle again. But like my father, he began to fall apart. He signed up for the Coast Guard, but during a training exercise, Dan dove into a pool and refused to rise to the surface. Divers had to drag his body out and resuscitate him. He was discharged. Other suicide attempts followed. My grandmother was understandably frantic that she might lose another son, but my grandfather began to build a distance between him and Dan. In his mind, the wrong son had died, and the surviving one had been only a disappointment. I know this because my grandfather never tried to hide it, never tried to assure Dan of any filial affection. My uncle became more and more erratic. He couldn't hold jobs, and he began to exhibit the same bipolar behavior that plagued his brother, my father. For decades to come, his doctors never succeeded in finding the right combination of medications to quiet his demons. Once he disappeared for months and was found wandering a roadside in Arizona, unrecognizable to himself. So Dan wouldn't end up homeless. My grandmother drew one concession from my grandfather, that he bequests to Dan their house and their will. My grandfather did that and nothing else. Dan did marry late in life and was supported by his wife's pension. And then he died. And then the woman my stepfather wouldn't let him marry appeared at his grave. And then just as quickly, she and her daughter disappeared from our lives. When I visited Dan's grave years later, I caught sight of the white cross that still sits atop the white steeple of the church my grandfather once pastored. Who worships there, I wonder? Who is their God? Thank you.
right up against the time that I'd hoped to get in this event. So I'll kind of leave any questions to you all to find our speakers afterwards and ask them. I want to first and foremost thank all of our very, very talented speakers for presenting today. One more round of applause for all of them. And then also thank you all for coming out, for hanging out. I hope you enjoyed it, and get home safe tonight. Take care.